Mr. Pritam Singh.
I'd like to thank Finance Minister for his roundup speech and the additional figures that Finance Minister gave. So I have some questions for the Finance Minister, and one of the hardest things I had to do with this budget actually was to try and assess how a GST hike can be staved off given the government's budget. And just as a matter of perspective on the question of using our reserves as a source of income, the government's reliance on reserves has quadrupled actually from 2006 to 2011, from about $2 billion to about $8 billion. And since then to the upcoming financial year, it's doubled from that. So when the minister says that the WP is irresponsible and dishonest, I respectfully have to disagree with him on that account. So with that as a preamble, I have 5 questions for the minister. First, in his second reading speech, when the Constitution was amended in 2015 to include Temasek in the NIRC framework, Finance Minister Tharman Shanmugaratnam said that Temasek's inclusion would increase the NIRC share of GDP from 2% to about 3% on average over 5 years. Today it stands at 3.4%. Does this tentatively suggest that the government actually has more income from NIRC than it originally planned to have, with more likely to be realized in future, in view of the fact that the NRI formula tends to smoothen out investment cycles? That's the first question. The second question has to do with a point I raised in my budget speech, which is whether there's any scope for raising NIRC from 60 to 70% for a short period of time to oversee large infrastructure spending, with a view to return this back to 50% on the condition that the revenues from such infrastructure must be returned to the past reserves. This would free up more of the government's budget in the respective financial years for recurrent spending, and this was one suggestion I put forward to stave off a GST hike, and I'm not sure whether the minister replied to that. The third question is with reference to the NIRC portion of this year's budget. How much in dollar terms of the 15.8 billion originated from the NII component of NIRC and the NIR component, respectively? And fourthly, how does the government determine which investment entity, MAS, Temasek, or GIC, gets a larger component of land sales revenue for investment in view of the different risk thresholds that each entity assumes? And finally, is there a mechanism or basis by which the government determines how much of the reserves it requires to maintain the strength of the Singapore dollar? Is there a mechanism for that? Thank you.
Well, I thank Mr. Pritam Singh for your question. For your first question about the fact that our NIRC has in fact become an increasing source of revenue for the government, that is correct. And in fact, we had this number have been doubling. So from 2 billion to 8 and to 16 that you mentioned. So in that regard, that's why I said that it is now the single largest source, and therefore we should be careful in having a more diversified source of revenue. Now, you asked about whether the fact that the overall NIRC contribution is 3.4%, whereas DPM Tharman has said that it's between 2 and 3% over the 5-year period. Is it because we are getting more? Well, the markets have been doing better, but bear in mind one thing: the NIRC is about long-term investment. It's about long-term investment, right? And therefore, you cannot be based on short-term fluctuations and decide that, well, henceforth in the future, we would have this 3, 4, 5% that we can rely on. It doesn't work that way. I was at the MAS when the global financial crisis happened. And I can tell you, I spent many days and nights and weekends looking at the market and how it was going to affect us. I attended so many meetings among global central bankers, CEOs of companies, of financial institutions, and with finance ministers, all in the developed world, and with major central banks, and you'll find that none foresaw the problem. Right? There were warnings about some of this by some analysts, but none foresaw the problem. And the impact was huge. So I think we must accept that there will be market volatility which you cannot predict. And it is not sound to build our finances on short-term fluctuations, whether it is up or down. And that is why the NIRC formula has a built-in way to smoothen these asset fluctuations. You don't want to have a situation where financial markets are doing very well, that the government spends a lot more, and then when the markets go down, which is probably when we need the resources most, that you have very little to meet those needs. So I think let's be very careful about over-interpreting the number. Now, your third comment, or third comment, about raising to 60–70% for short period for infra, isn't this another way of touching your reserves, changing the formula to use it and say, at some point, I would put it back? I don't see the logic of that argument. And in fact, what we are doing, or what we are hoping to do, is that we want to have proper discipline and scrutiny of borrowing for infrastructure. And that is why we are going to discuss with the President and the CPA that we think that a proper way of doing this is to issue bonds in the market so that investors can scrutinize those numbers and see that these are viable projects. Right? And then seeking the approval of the President and CPA to provide a guarantee. So that again, there's another layer of check. But at the same time, that layer of guarantee allows us to access funding at probably a better rate. And so you are using the strengths of the reserves strategically, but without touching the reserves, so that reserves can continue to be invested for long-term gains. So that is the approach, and therefore, whether you are taking 50, 55, 60, 70% for short period of time, it sounds like it is a costless option. It is not. It is not, right? It cannot do it that way, and that the way that we are proposing is conceptually sound and financially sound. Now you asked about how the land sales proceeds and all that get to MAS, GIC, and Temasek, and how do we divide that? Now we have a whole of government's reserve management committee chaired by the Prime Minister, and there we look at the risks and returns of the different entities, risks and returns across the different markets, and allocate it for the long-term for long-term gains, taking into account both the returns as well as the risk and the current market environment. Now, your last question about the basis of the reserves for the strength of the Singh dollar. Now, let me clarify. There's been a lot of misunderstanding on this point. Now, certainly a strong reserves help us to anchor confidence. But MAS's needs, in terms of what it does as a central bank, is very different from almost all central banks in the world. All central banks in the world adopt an interest rate policy. So whether it is the Fed or the ECB or the BOJ, the central bank announces certain policy rates, and then they undertake certain operations to get to that rate if they need to. But the announcement itself and the anticipation of the announcement have very major impact on the economy, and that's how they conduct monetary policy. In our case, our monetary policy is centered on the exchange rate. And again, I must say great credit to Dr. Goh and his team very early on for deciding on this most unusual way of dealing with our monetary policy. And the reason is this: the exchange rate has a far bigger impact on the state of the economy than interest rates. We are a very open economy, and therefore the exchange rate affects economic activities in a far more significant way. And the MAS regularly updates our trade numbers and updates our economic model to see if that remains valid. And the studies that they have done from looking at the studies that they have done, I'm convinced that it remains the right policy, that to have exchange rate-centered policy to be able to manage the economy. So the reserves are not just about maintaining the strength of the Sing dollar. The MAS manages our official foreign reserves, and it undertakes operations in the market in order to get to the desired, to get to the band, and also it makes policy announcements regularly so that the market is clear about the official assessment of the economy. Now, the market may or may not agree, and in which case you will see currency movement, but I must say that MAS has done a very good job over the years, and so the market generally accepts MAS's intervention, but MAS's policy announcement. But in terms of maintaining the strength of the Sing dollar, the reserves play a very important crisis role, which was what was tested during the Asian financial crisis. That when speculators were speculating on the positions of other currencies, they did not touch very much the Sing dollar because they know of two very fundamental reasons. One, our finances are sound, that our fiscal policy at the various stages of the crisis are sound. And that is why I mentioned that we are one of 11 countries with a AAA credit rating. All these firms who are doing credit rating look at the numbers very carefully before they give us a AAA rating. So that is one important anchor. And two, speculators know that should they try to attack the Sing dollar, it is not just our official reserves that they have to contend with. We also have reserves that are invested in longer-term assets and that we will be able to mobilize if we need to. So those are the very important defenses that we have for the Sing dollar. And the very fact that the Sing dollar has risen is not just because of a monetary policy. The fundamental reason is that our economy has been doing better, that the real economy has got its position correct, that we have been upgrading and revamping the economy over the years, and therefore the currency moves up in order to play the equilibrating role.